to deal with issues relating to media freedom, diversity, media transformation, and gradually down the years we broadened our focus to also look at the communication rights. In the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations about mass surveillance abuses, particularly in the global north, we also decided to start asking questions about the extent to which South Africa could be described as a surveillance state or surveillance society that's governed by a surveillance state. There were also a number of local cases of what we felt was unwarranted surveillance that concerned us as well. So we started undertaking research and also working with investigative journalists as well to try and map out the picture of what was going on in South Africa. And even more recently, we've started extending the work to the Southern African region as well. In the course of conducting that work, we've commissioned a number of research reports, including a research report by Murray Hunter, who is a long-time information activist, former spokesperson and activist with the Right to Know campaign. He now has his own consultancy focusing on information rights called Circle Up. And he's going to be speaking to us about a report that he finished fairly recently called Cops and Call Records, Policing and Metadata Privacy. So I'm going to be doing very little speaking. I'm going to be handing over to Murray to speak about the report, but to also speak about the implications of the report as well for the use of location data in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we speak about metadata, we're speaking very broadly about data about our communications. And increasingly, researchers and privacy advocates have been making the argument that metadata reveals as much, if not more, about us than communication content. And this is because the content of our communication is often just simply a snapshot of what we've said or what we're thinking at a particular moment in time. Whereas metadata often reveals much more about who we are, what we're thinking, what our interests are, who our associations are, who our most intimate contacts are, and what our movements are as well. So it allows us to track over a longer period of time people's most the most intimate part of people's lives. However, we're finding that there's a law and policy lag when it comes to protecting metadata. We're finding that privacy protections are insufficient for metadata given its levels of sensitivity. We've tended to focus on protecting content rather than metadata, and South Africa is no exception to that general rule. And Murray is going to speak about the existing status quo when it comes to metadata, the uses and abuses of metadata, particularly by the police. And he's going to be speaking about these issues from a very interesting perspective. And this is what I think makes his report so unique, because he's looking in a fairly dispassionate way at the policing case for using metadata in order to solve cases of crimes. And then from there, he's going to be looking at what can be done in order to increase privacy protections for metadata, and what the implications are, given that we've already got systemic weaknesses in how metadata is regulated in South Africa, the implications for the use of location data in the fight against COVID-19. Because in spite of the fact that we have fairly weak protections that hopefully will be upgraded in the years and months to come, we have surprisingly strong regulations that have been passed by government. And we're going to be reflecting a little bit in this seminar on the reasons why we have those particular anomalies. So I'll allow Murray to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. I may follow up with a couple of observations and questions after that, depending on what he says, and then we will turn over to the participants to ask questions through chat. So Murray, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Folks, this is a very unusual environment for me, so let's see how it goes. But I guess that we're all developing expertise in two matters, as not just the nation, but as entire global society, and expertise in epidemiology and in Zoom meetings. Yeah, very quickly to say that this research on policing was done back all those many decades ago when we were worried about things that didn't relate to a global pandemic. And it seemed, I guess I didn't realize how quickly information about communications, sort of a discussion of communications, metadata, privacy would become relevant in the time of a pandemic. And we thought we would have to shelf this research and really struggle to get people to pay attention. But of course, it became very relevant very quickly in the context of a pandemic. But quickly to say, to add a bit more detail to what Jane was saying about sort of growing concerns about communications privacy in South Africa, I think there are really two big threads that have occupied my thinking, and I guess the thinking of many of the people I've been working alongside. And the first is really the rise of the securocrats sort of narrative that we see in post-94 South Africa. You can read this in Jane's book, you can read this in brief in our report, which is available at mediaanddemocracy.com probably. But in the 2000s, the South Africa's intelligence agencies and the police, which had been reformulated in the 90s, they immediately, there were signs that the powers that were given to those agencies under the new constitutional order were still being abused, that there was politicization, that spying powers were being used against adversaries in politics, they were being used in factional ways within the agencies, possibly also just being used by individuals in those agencies for their own private reasons as well, as it not for a factional purpose. And in the kind of final period of the Mbeki, the Mbeki administration, there was a ministerial inquiry into the intelligence agencies and their sort of lack of adherence to the new constitution, called the Matthews Commission. It came out, it was actually leaked just as Mbeki was ousted. And it really showed the first very firm, documented, thorough investigation, I think, into the extent to which the intelligence agencies were abusing those powers, including the right to spy and its spying powers. So lots of people on this call have been involved in the Constitutional Court challenge to RICA, our main surveillance law. And probably there's several of them who could speak in detail on that. So I will quickly just say that fast forward 10 years from the 2008 Matthews Commission, thank you very much to the person in our chat who is sharing their views on this. Let us, please, someone get rid of that person. I'll leave it to Theo.
I've done that.
Okay, wonderful. Oh my Lord. But you know, freedom of expression, it's an important value. Just to say that the fast forward 10 years from the Matthews Commission, Amubungani, Center for Investigative Journalism, was able to bring a constitutional court challenge to RICA, the main surveillance law, on the basis that one of its members, Sam Saul, a journalist, had been spied on for at least 6 months. State intelligence agents, for reasons that have never actually been explained, were listening in on Sam Saul's calls with confidential sources. And the facts around that case were really provided the scaffolding for Amubungani and its lawyers to point to key weaknesses in the surveillance law and the way that it had failed to protect against abuse and failed to protect people's privacy. Now, that is RICA. And it has really put a lot of focus into the extent of oversight of South Africa's surveillance laws, the extent to which these laws have protected the content of people's communication, in particular, what we say over the phone, what we say in a Zoom meeting, what we say in a text message. But as Amubungani raises, in their court case, there are a range of problems in the way that the law protects what Jane called metadata, communications metadata, not what we say in our messages or over the phone or in emails, but the fact that there is a communication. So the person A and person B are communicating at this time, they're in these locations, they use these devices, and what would show up on your phone records, for example, is communications metadata. And the law, even RICA as it stands, the law does not protect that information as closely as it protects the content of communications. That's an issue that is in front of the Constitutional Court now with the Amubungani challenge. But what I was looking at with this COPS and call records report is the extent to which those phone records are being accessed using powers that aren't in RICA. So for example, RICA says that if your phone is if your communications or communications metadata is to be intercepted, it can only be for high categories of crime. It needs to be with the approval of a relatively senior judge, and there are all kinds of oversight measures in place. Now, we argue that those oversight measures are not adequate, but they are there. The issue is in other criminal law, the Criminal Procedure Act and other, and related laws. It is possible for police officers to seize the communications metadata, our phone records, for example, not the content of our calls, but the fact that we're calling each other and details of that communication. They can seize that using essentially a subpoena power, which says that this is not communications metadata, this is not private sensitive information, it's just evidence. In the same way that they might seize a letter or any kind of other evidence, they seize those call records. And what we see, we call that the Section 205 procedures, because it's Section 205 of the Criminal Procedure Act. Those subpoena powers are being used to seize people's communications metadata a lot more frequently than anyone is intercepting communications in terms of RICA. So what has happened in the Amubungani case, I think very importantly, is we put a lot of focus into how state surveillance is working under RICA, and particularly focusing on the contents of people's communications. Not necessarily, I don't think that the case is focused on that, but the conversation around it is focused on that. But there is this whole other avenue where a great deal more information is being seized on other grounds with much less oversight. Essentially, it can be the most junior court in the land can issue a subpoena for people's call records. And we have seen cases where that's been abused. Journalists, for example, having their phone records seized using essentially an affidavit or a fraudulent warrant from a low-level police officer. And those are the kinds of abuses we are looking at in COPS and call records. The question of why this matters is firstly the fact that the law has failed to protect the privacy of the communications is a problem, because privacy is a protected right in the Constitution. So on its own, that this is a problem. And the lack of proportionality in when the right to privacy can be invaded is a concern for all of us. But in particular, there are all these other reasons that we go into in the report. And one of them is that it allows particularly vulnerable people to be targeted: investigative journalists, whistleblowers, activists, for example, people who have lawyers, judges, people whose communications that in their capacity as someone who's engaged in the democratic process or engaged in public life, their communications is particularly sensitive, and we have reason to believe that they are particularly vulnerable to being targeted in this way. And I think that the third case, and this is speaking to the policing case for reform, is that having unguarded access to this valuable information is actually potentially a vector for corruption. So in the abuses that we try to document, when a rogue officer in the police or state security have abused their powers in order to access someone's private communication or metadata, it's often for not for law enforcement purposes, not for sort of conventional law enforcement purposes, but it's for political factional purposes, or it's for private criminal purposes. So, for example, a private investigator might be hired by a client to spy on a certain individual, whether it's a spouse or business partner or rival of some kind. in order to get the phone records of their target, they go to a colleague or former colleague in the police. That police officer uses their access to subpoena powers, essentially, to get someone's phone records. And we think it's a massive vector for corruption. And so where the state has been pushing back against calls for reform, I think it's quite important that we make the case that this is not only about protecting human rights, although that should be enough, but it's actually about protecting the state's capacity to root out corruption in its own ranks. And what's very interesting in speaking to police, as I was doing in Cops and Call Records, is finding out how many officials I spoke to who had been involved in anti-corruption work within the law enforcement structures, the investigating other colleagues, how many of them feel communications had been spied on. And so, where we have often framed the case for reform by pointing to journalists, whistleblowers, activists, etc., what's interesting is that policemen themselves, or police officers rather, fear the power of surveillance as well. And it's quite important to note that, just because I think it creates important opportunities for reform. I had 10 minutes and I was distracted by the person in our chat group, so I'll quickly refocus. This was all much more easy for me to keep in my head before COVID-19 locked down everything. I think it's become very difficult for any of us to think about anything that's not a pandemic. But an interesting thing happened with the COVID-19 phone tracking regulations. We're certainly not the only country that is exploring whether or not someone's communications metadata, such as their locational history, can be used to combat a pandemic. And there's a lot of controversy the world over about the nature of the regulations that governments are seeking and the powers that they're seeking to use that kind of private information, even though it may in fact be useful in a pandemic. And I think it was the afternoon on lockdown eve, Thursday the 26th of March, about 5 p.m. The Department of Telecommunications gazetted a policy directive that says, from now on, even though, it doesn't say this, I'm just summing up, even though ordinarily someone's locational information from their cell phone provider could never be accessed unless they're suspected of generally a high-level crime, and if there's the permission of a judge or some kind of judicial figure. From now on, cell phone providers and the ISPs will be required to hand over information about anyone who's either suspected of having COVID-19 or who may have come into contact with COVID-19. What this was really and it was really a single paragraph in these policy directives, but it would have greatly expanded the powers of the state to intercept people's private communication without a warrant. And this raised concerns. People wrote op-eds. I think that people took to Twitter, as we want to do. And an interesting thing happened, which is that we got a sense over the course of the next few days that there were more regulations coming. And what ended up happening is that the state introduced new regulations that kind of amended and added to those initial policy directions, but essentially they added significant privacy protections and oversight measures into those tracking procedures. And we can talk about them more in the Q&A. They're not perfect, but they're pretty significant. And what was quite interesting about that is that in some ways, the emergency tracking procedures that are contained in our COVID-19 regulations are actually better than the regular interception procedures that we have. There are oversight measures in there, for example, that someone whose information is intercepted using, or rather seized using these COVID-19 regulations, they would be notified essentially within 6 weeks of the end of the state of disaster. So that user notification is one example of an oversight measure that we have been calling for years, and the state has said it would be impossible to implement. It would be a disaster for policing. It's one of the key things that they've been fighting in the Amabugani Rika case, and boom, they put it into emergency regulations. And it really, as much as I don't think we should, I think that whole process needs to be watched quite closely, and there needs to be a lot of critical scrutiny of it. It was really an example of the fact that the state doesn't speak with one voice when it comes to its views on this. There are different parts of the state, different actors within the state with different perspectives. And when COVID-19, when it's over, but as we progress beyond the current situation, as things go back to something resembling normal, there will be an opportunity to push for those kinds of protections to be expanded to our general day-to-day laws. And that is quite encouraging. And so as much as I think that there was necessary concern about the South African regulations, I think that the picture in other countries is much more concerning in some ways about the way that digital data is being used as part of the pandemic response. But there is something encouraging there, and I think that's worth talking about as well. So I'm trying to look at where I am on time, Jane, because I think that I've been ranting for about 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm happy to take a pause there and we can talk more about one or two of those things.
Okay, thank you very much, Murray. Perhaps a couple of issues that you could address before we turn over to the participants. The first is, you've spoken about the Department of Telecommunications directive that was issued, that was worryingly vague, that didn't really spell out any kind of procedure for using location data for contact tracing. And then we had the regulations that were subsequently released that spelt out largely, perhaps not completely, a much better procedure. What shifted between the directives and the regulations? What do you think happened that led to such, I think, a fundamental shift in thinking? The other issue that I'd very much like you to address is, in the report, you speak about an issue that clearly you're conflicted about, and that relates to the blanket retention of metadata. So in terms of RECA, communication service providers are meant to store people's metadata for between 3 to 5 years. And that doesn't matter whether people are suspected of a crime or not. It's a blanket requirement to retain metadata for that period. Now, you seem to be conflicted in the report about whether that's a good or a bad thing, because there are a lot of people internationally who argue that we shouldn't have blanket retention of metadata, and that rather we should be moving towards targeted preservation orders. But obviously the police don't know what they don't know. And we're seeing now in the fight against COVID-19, the utility of having blanket metadata retention. We obviously are not clear about whether the Department of Health will be looking for real-time metadata or archive metadata. And if they're looking for archive metadata, they're probably only looking for about a month or two's worth of metadata. Now, in view of the utility of the metadata database, if you could put it like that, in the fight against COVID-19, what is your thinking about how justifiable blanket retention of metadata is? And then the third issue I wanted to raise is, what is the potential for misuse of the COVID-19 database? Because in terms of the regulations, there will be a centralized database that's established. And after a certain period of time, after the state of disaster has lapsed, because in South Africa, we have a state of disaster that's been declared, not a state of emergency, which I think is quite significant because fundamental rights haven't been suspended. So once the state of disaster has lapsed, then there is a requirement in the regulations to de-anonymize, to de-identify and anonymize information that is retained in the database for research purposes in future. And there's a special judge, the COVID-19 judge, who is meant to oversee that process and can direct the Department of Health to upgrade the privacy protections if she's not happy with how they're going about that process. But one of the major controversies internationally is that it's actually very difficult to de-anonymize or to anonymize, sorry, and de-identify location data. And that using a variety of data points, you can actually re-identify individuals. Now, given that potential for misuse at some stage in the future, how safe do you think we are having a centralized COVID-19 database that's going to be retained beyond the life of the virus?
Yeah. So the first question about what shifted, I think that the fuller history probably is yet to be told, about why the state, or why different departments sort of, how that those are kind of those policy directives took a journey of 7 days, really. That in some ways over those 7 days, different parts of the state went further than they've ever gone before on privacy protections in a time of an emergency. Not a state of emergency, but still, I think we'll agree an emergency. I was speaking with someone who's a sort of a legal practitioner who was saying, well, look, one of the things that has happened is a lot of these regulations that are getting produced, across government, are being done by private legal practitioners, essentially advocates sitting not in chambers, sitting at home. And the reason why these things are sometimes pretty good is because these are people who are not necessarily locked into governance. They often are in legal practice. They're often working sort of for clients opposing government's regulations. And so he says, look, these people sit on Twitter and they see what people are saying, and they obviously have their own views from their own cases. And I had been talking about how great it was that, with some caveats, like that the journey of these regulations showed a great deal of responsiveness to concerns about privacy. And he said, look, the kind of irony is that this is the point at which government is most responsive because it's least democratic. The fact that there's a few people working on these regulations, and without any real public participation, but by speaking to the right people, they can kind of knock these things together. It's given us this, I think, pretty good set of regulations in my view, but it does have its weaknesses as well. There's other issues. I mean, I think that my sense was that certain players in industry, your MTNs and Vodacoms, may have wanted to lawyer up to challenge the initial set of directives, or to challenge what they saw as a potential overreach. Whether for that was, for good intentions or for their own interests, we don't know. But that might have been a significant issue as well. But I do want to say that I get the strong sense, and others have said the same thing, that in different ways, the relevant officials have telegraphed very clearly that they understand the concerns, and that they consider these to be necessary steps, but they want to telegraph very clearly that they're acting in good faith. And so, for example, the fact that the regulations got produced in as much detail with the sort of concessions to privacy concerns that were in there is one clear indication. The fact of the judge who would oversee the system, the fact that it was Kate O'Regan, and which is not just any judge, but a very, very highly regarded judge with a stellar reputation, is a clear indication again that these concerns are being taken seriously, and concessions are being made to address those concerns. Any judge could have been put there, but this isn't just any judge. So I do think that there is an element of what's shifting being that officials involved did hear those concerns and acted on them. An interesting point that was made by Andries de Tooy, who's at UWC, about why we're seeing such inconsistent or such different voices and tendencies within the state, is that the state is fractured, and you've got certain parts of the state who act from a public health mentality, which is kind of quite social democratic, and you've got certain parts of the state who come from a securocratic mentality, and that's why these sort of these different actions and characters and postures are being taken up. I will say one thing though, so having spoken to the officials involved in the Department of Communications when those regulations were first handed down, or rather when the directives were first handed down, the first bad ones, that I don't think that there was any kind of ideology or sort of rational policy thinking, like it wasn't a rational policy articulation. The people I was speaking to couldn't engage at it's kind of at a substantive level with the questions that we were putting to them, to say, you know, do you understand the privacy concerns that are coming up? And they say, well, it's not private information, it's locational information, that's not private. And even in terms of the regressive laws that we've already criticized, that is considered private information, and that this would be a major policy shift in the wrong direction. So I don't think it was necessarily even, the initial moves may have not even been a rational bad guy move, it's just people having a go at regulation. The second question was about going back to this question of the state essentially under RICA, as you say, the blanket retention of metadata. Is it a good or bad thing? So just kind of summing up the situation is that as it currently stands by law, by RICA, for law enforcement purposes, every cell phone provider is required to store a log of all of our communication going back 3 years, which means that as I sit right now, MTN knows by dint of my phone records, they know pretty much every place I've been to in the last 3 years, everyone who I've interacted with digitally in terms of a voice or SMS call. They know where I was sleeping this night 3 years ago because of my cell phone records. And so that's stored for, you know, for law enforcement purposes. And it's a real concern. There are different, I think I do go back and forth on this, because we know that those that information that's stored, we know that it is that the oversight and safeguards on that information aren't sufficient. We know that those powers have been abused, but we also know that this is a country of really significant safety problems that everyone in this country has in some way, and often every day feels unsafe. And that the state is, you know, when it speaks about how it uses these powers in Ambubugani, for example, they do talk, obviously they lean very far away from the privacy and civil rights and human rights point of view, but they say, well, actually protecting the safety of the person is our key responsibility, and that's why we have to keep this information for 3 years. But the sort of the nuance of it is to say, the binary choice is not between do we keep it or not keep it. The circumstances under which we keep it or don't keep it are also important. So for example, South Africa's, the fact that we store it for 3 years is extraordinary at a global level. Like I think in the research, we look at a survey of something like 36 countries who have mandatory storage of metadata. South Africa is by far the longest period of all of those 36 countries. I think the average is slightly less than 12 months. And so the state could never really explain why it needed to store that information for 3 years, except they sometimes say, well, it's because policing takes so long in South Africa, and that's why we need it for 3 years, because we don't know if an investigation will be closed in 3 years. But, you know, I think that there are some piecemeal protections that can be put in place, reducing the period stored for example, from 3 years to, let's say, 90 days, 3 months, which is one of the things that is before the courts or was before the courts in RICA. Unfortunately, I don't think that one carried over in the High Court. You can increase the oversight measures to ensure that information that's stored for 90 days is not accessed for abusive purposes. So it can only be accessed with high levels of categories of crime, robust and transparent oversight, and where where essentially there's a balancing of that individual's right to protect that information versus the interests of the state in accessing it. The reason, Jane, why I ended up dodging the question in the report is that I was speaking to law enforcement officers, and so it's very much rooted in the kind of mentality of law enforcement, which is to say we're always losing the fight. Police are always, have a perception, and I think maybe not an undue one, of being under siege in the sort of fight against crime. And they said, well, look, we need every tool we can get because we're always at a disadvantage. And this is a very important tool, and we only use it rarely, and we can use it less rarely, we can use it less frequently even, is one of the bits of feedback I got in the report, if needed, and with more oversight if needed. But we never know when a crime will be committed, and often it's a crime that's extremely violent, and there's no witness, and cell phone records are the only way for us to identify a perpetrator. And the idea of a targeted preservation order, which says instead of seeking a warrant that says let's get those phone records, but let's get a warrant that says from now on we want you to store these phone records to the to MTN, and we will access them afterwards. The reason that proposal has little prospect of success is that they never know who the criminal will be until they've committed the crime. And look, I found it persuasive. I couldn't in these debates that I was having with my interviewees, I couldn't win that one. And that's why I've ended up feeling in two minds about it. Yes, that is that. And then Jane, very quickly, the third question you asked was about the potential for misuse of the COVID-19 the COVID-19 location tracking orders. There's potential for misuse with any, when you're collecting sensitive private information like this and you're putting it in a database under any circumstances. I think there is always an element of risk and potentially an element of big risk. The regulations that we were talking about go some way to reducing that risk. So for example, by ensuring that information can only be sought for a very limited purpose, which is essentially when someone is almost certainly carrying COVID-19 or is almost certain to have come in contact with someone carrying COVID-19. It can only be collected by public health officials for that public health process. So law enforcement has been cut off from it completely. It can only be stored if it's necessary, essentially, to contact trace. Anything that is not necessary to those purposes must be destroyed within 6 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think that the biggest, look, there's two potentials for misuse that I see that are worth thinking about. And the first is that once you put something in a database, it is always hackable. And it may actually be hackable by our state, by another state, by private actors. And that is a very significant threat. And I think that does need to be considered. The second is the one that you pointed to, which is that this database of contact tracing can at some point can be adapted. So the regulations say that it must be anonymized afterwards and preserved for research purposes. And the big concern there, as you say, is that anonymized information is never truly anonymized. And there's a lot of research that says that anonymizing public health data is a non-trivial thing. And I think it's an issue that public health officials and epidemiologists and researchers talk about all the time, is that they sit on these vast databases of information that they're not 100% sure are anonymized. And it's a public health and a policy question, which I don't have the answer to. But at the very least, we've got these regulations now. If they stand, it will be about ensuring that the very necessary, that far-reaching technical steps are taken to protect against the de-anonymization of that information. And I don't think that it is, one gets a sense, for all of the reasons I just listed, that isn't in there as a loophole. It isn't in there to say, wow, we finally, now that we've got all this information, we can finally abuse it in some way. But it's a regular, it's a provision put in there potentially in good faith, but understanding that it carries the risk that for good or, with good intentions or bad intentions, that information may still be sensitive. And I'm grappling with that. I think it would be one that I would take to debate. And I think that public health officials or public health voices, including experts in academia and research, should also make their voices heard on this. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? We as the public, most of us not epidemiological experts, need some kind of a context for us to have this debate about the balance that all of us are being asked to weigh up here. And one of the challenges we have is that privacy experts are usually not epidemiological experts, and the vice versa is true as well. So we're seeing lots of competing voices, not just in South Africa, but globally, of policy experts in one area saying this is the only solution or this is an absolute disaster. And it's very difficult to find a view that kind of straddles those perspectives. And I think that's me, Jane.
All right. Thank you very much, Murray. We've got a couple of questions. So one question is whether government can listen to our private calls. The regulations actually state explicitly that the COVID-19 interception measures is strictly for location data and cannot be used in order to obtain or intercept communication content. So if the authorities want to do that, then they're going to have to go through the standard RICA process. There's another question in connection with any tech that may be acquired, the course of the fight against COVID-19, and whether it can be misused at some stage in the future. And in fact, Edward Snowden made this point just recently in an interview, that the architecture of oppression is being built under our noses and with our consent, because people are scared. They want this pandemic, the war against this pandemic, to be won. They just want the crisis to go away. And because of that, I think we are willing to give up rights that under ordinary circumstances we wouldn't be willing to give up. And in addition to that, tech is being acquired that obviously that they're not going to sell once the fight against COVID-19 has hopefully been won. So the person who's asking the question speaks about drones that have been acquired and are being used in Tsanin. And I think there, drone use is not explicitly regulated in terms of the regulations. So we should be concerned there about the potential for abuse, and particularly in view of the fact that the Civil Aviation Authority's own regulations, their regulation of drones for privacy are desperately fall short. So I think certainly if drones are going to be acquired in the fight against COVID-19, then there are no sunset clauses that are actually written into regulations anywhere that will prevent them from being misused at some stage in the future. And perhaps just to augment a comment that Murray made, or an answer that Murray gave in response to my first question, why do the regulations look so different from the directives? And I think a lot of that has to do with public pressure. I don't think the regulations as we have them would have looked as good as they did had the Constitutional Court case not been brought against RICA by the Amamugani Center for Investigative Journalism. So the fact that user notification, for instance, has been incorporated into the regulations, I think is a direct result of government realizing that they're not going to get a free pass when it comes to abuses of privacy, that there are people watching and who are willing to act and even are willing to litigate on these issues if abuses in fact occur. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other surveillance technologies that have been acquired and that potentially are being used that could be abused because they haven't received the same kind of attention, and government isn't feeling as concerned about abusing them as they would in relation to location data. And then there is a question from Azara about the protections that were added to the lockdown regulations. Murray, can you perhaps briefly explain what those protections are?
Certainly. So I want to quickly point, just going back to the question or the point raised by Pindile about whether you have emergency powers that outlast the emergency. And as I said, I think in respect of the specific kind of contact tracing regulations we're talking about, South Africa performs relatively well compared to many of the disastrous things that we see being rolled out elsewhere, because very specifically it has a kill switch. Within 6 weeks of essentially the declared state of disaster ending, which is currently somewhere in mid-June, I think, within 6 weeks, those powers lapse. And so that is one thing. But we do, I don't know about other emergency regulations that we see coming out of this disaster, which do, as you said, Jen, do require more scrutiny. But one of the things I've been thinking about is the fact that we've spent a lot of time, for good reason, thinking about excuse me, a lot of time. It's just what a lot of time in current conditions could be just 7 days, but it feels like a century. But in the last few weeks, a lot of attention is being paid to these emergency regulations, particularly around tracking, and saying, well, is government getting these new powers that can use to abuse us and abuse our privacy and track us? We've had very little information and very little time to talk about whether the state is abusing its existing surveillance powers and how it might be using those existing surveillance powers, which we've noted are not, are not fantastic from a human rights point of view. Is that there is a history, a legacy of abuse of those powers, and we have very little information, I think, about what is happening in state security in the last 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And what new technology or processes or old technology and old processes they're using in the current conditions. The same is true for crime intelligence of the police. And that is, I think that, the fact that those agencies haven't made their voices clearly heard in this is a real concern. So what we're seeing out in the streets with physical violence and physical brutality, it might just be part of a bigger problem. I think that's just something worth bearing in mind. Going to the protections that we have in these regulations. I've sent in the chat just 2 analyses that I think are worth looking at, the one by Jane and the other by 2 attorneys from Weber Wenzel, both on the Daily Maverick, that sort of break it down, but I'll quickly overview. I guess there's a range of criteria that people have listed globally to try to reduce the risk. Even people who, human rights advocates who are saying, we understand the need for digital data to be used. This is the way we would need protections. Number 1, that the powers must be limited in terms of their scope and their timeframes. Number 2, that there must be sufficient oversight and transparency. Number 3, that their purpose must be limited to public health purpose, a very clearly defined one. And what we see in these regulations is, number 1, information can only be used, information can only be sought about someone's location if specifically they're suspected of being exposed to a person with COVID-19. Secondly, there's a time frame that any information collected about them can only be preserved if it is necessary to do contact tracing. It needs to be destroyed within 6 weeks if it's falls out. Extraneous is the word I'm looking for. The powers themselves only last for the state of emergency plus 6 weeks, I think. The oversight measures are, number 1, that there is a oversight judge, essentially borrowing some of the parts of the oversight measures in our RICA surveillance law. There's a judge that would oversee this process. He or she, in this case, doesn't have the power to decide who gets spied on, but gets notified of the name and details of everyone whose details are logged, and has the power to recommend to cabinet that it amends the regulations as it goes, as she sees fit, to further protect privacy. And the final point is that she gets, I think, weekly reports. And then finally, that when it comes to dismantling the whole system, the judge then does have the power to direct conditions under which she thinks that that dismantling of the system needs to happen, including the anonymizing of any data that was collected for further research purposes, and that those reports get tabled to Parliament. So aside from those protections, I think what's not in there, but also, the final one, excuse me, is that anyone whose data is seized as part of this process gets notified by the Department of Health, I think, within 6 weeks as well. So that is, sorry, I'm speaking from memory, but I think those are the main ones. And crucially, that the law enforcement agencies, who are the ones with the history and frankly the inclination of abusing these kinds of powers, has been robustly, cut out of the whole process, which I think is, so what's not in there in some ways is, which is the role of the police or state security, is as important as what's in there.
Thank you very much, Murray. And perhaps just to augment Murray's